I'm going to talk about something called the Chicago Plan. How many of you have heard about the Chicago Plan? Oh, okay, so about 5 people. Good. There are other reasons besides central location to be in Chicago. Chicago has a rather dramatic history in terms of monetary reform on more than one level. Now, why is monetary reform of such critical overriding importance? Why do we place this at the top of our list? Well, the fact is that a monetary system, the impact on citizens' lives of money, is greater than the executive power, it's greater than the legislative power, it's greater than the judicial power. It's actually a fourth branch. It represents a fourth branch of government, or it should. In reality, it is. And this is one of the reasons that leaving it in private hands is utterly unacceptable. It negates the balancing of powers principle in our Constitution. It creates an aristocracy which is forbidden by our Constitution, really a plutocracy which is the rule by wealth. Our nation's based on something better than that. It's based on citizens' rights. It's based on fair dealing in social, legal, and commercial matters. A privately controlled money system can nullify any hard-won reform in any area, whether it's in medical treatment or in peace initiatives or wherever it is. Witness the attack right now on Roosevelt's Social Security reforms. You cannot allow privately controlled money behind your lines, because this is a battle. We didn't start this battle, but we're in it. You can't allow that behind your lines and move forward with any kind of security. It won't work. What does monetary reform really mean? It's simple. It means establishing a fair system that doesn't give some groups advantages and other groups disadvantages. So it doesn't concentrate wealth and power that leads to strife and hatred and all of the bad things we're seeing, and ultimately on the international level will lead to warfare. It also means helping the society create values for living well. Now, you received a draft of our American Money Act in your package. Please read it before tomorrow's meeting on that. We're going to invite comments from you in the session and also take the time to study it and send us letters on it. We'll incorporate these, the good points that we see. We may have missed things there. This is the 9th version. We're going to invite comments from others. We'll do the 10th version, as I've mentioned. That's the first public version of this that will then go out on the internet. And we'll get more, I'm sure we'll find things in it from others that we should alter. That's what we're in the process of doing. We're learning. We're still learning. Now, all it is, quite simply, it's a way of putting into legal terms the single reform from Chapter 24 of the Lost Science of Money book. Now, it's a single reform, but it's 3 parts. And all 3 parts have to go in, or any individual part is just going to lead to more trouble. And we'll discuss that today a bit and tomorrow. It's vitally important that we are ready with a workable plan when, not if, the financial meltdown occurs. No one knows when that'll be, because there's tremendous power in the control of a nation's monetary system. But still, the warning signs have been visible for years, and it could even be triggered by a couple of bad hurricanes. The American Monetary Act, some of the people we send it to, they get back to me and say, well, this is really radical. Well, radical, okay, in the sense of going to the root of a problem. But that's what we want to do. I'm not interested in spending a lot of time working on anything that's just going to result in a temporary reprieve. I want to get to something basic. I think that's what we owe our lives. If we are going to treat our lives seriously, we have to get to accomplish something real for the future, for humanity. But actually the American Monetary Act is part of a very long tradition, goes all the way back to what is called the Chicago Plan of the Great Depression. And that plan was very close, the Brits may be or may not be aware, but that plan was very close independently to one that was advanced by the great scientist Frederick Soddy in England in 1926. So we're going to start in December of 1932. It's been only 20 years, just 20 years since the Fed was founded. Here's what happened from 1929 to 32. Crash of 32. National income dropped 52%. Industrial production down 47%. Wholesale prices down 32%. Real debt value, because money was increasing in value, the value of real debt rose 140% during the Depression. This is not understood sometimes. Unemployment rose 329%, all in less than 20 years of the Fed's existence. In that horrendous climate, many economists were aware that the banking system itself was a major cause, if not the only cause, of that problem, and that major changes were needed. One fear of the bankers and economists was simply that all of the banks would be nationalized, not only the Federal Reserve banks, but every bank, and that banking would then be a government activity. In fact, they thought, because people were so angry, that revolution might be sparked. So in that atmosphere, the best economic minds in the country devised a reform plan that we don't hear about today. Henry Simons from the University of Chicago created the proposal, and prominent economists from other universities joined him in what became known as the Chicago Plan. Economists like Paul, these are great names among economists that you cannot find this many people today to name like this. Economists like Paul Douglas of the U of C, Frank Graham, who's been discussed already, and Charles Whittlesey of Princeton, Irving Fisher of Yale, Earl Hamilton of Duke, Wilford King of NYU, just to name a few. One version of the Chicago Plan went to all academic economists, about 1,000 total. Of those responding, 235 from 157 universities agreed with the proposal. Another 40 approved it with reservations. Only 45 disapproved it. So the plan had tremendous professional support. Variants of the plan usually started by condemning the banking structure as foolish and harmful. Quote, if the purpose of money and credit were to discourage the exchange of goods and services and destroy periodically the wealth produced, to frustrate and trip those who save, our present monetary system does that most effectively. Still true. They dispensed immediately with the gold standard. It's not a real standard at all. It's always been a silly thing. Because the value, it's been applied badly, but it was never a real thing. The value of gold had changed violently up and down against commodities. From 1914 to 1917, wholesale prices rose 65%. Then another 55% up until May 20. So from 1914 to 20, first 6 years of the Fed's existence, gold coins lost over 75% of their value. Okay, a year later, wholesale prices fell 56%. This is not a standard to have gold fluctuating like that. It's a joke. And hard money advocates who still today believe that gold is stable and has been stable are just unaware of these facts. But they're facts. And this has continued today. Look, if you look at the gold price in the last 10 years, up to 850, down to 228, up and down. That is not a standard. And the gold bugs will tell you, oh, it's the dollar that's changing. Well, that's nonsense. Now, one version of the plan quoted Roosevelt, who referred to gold accurately as an old fetish of so-called international bankers. Now, the main features of the Chicago Plan were the following. Only the government, number one, only the government would create money. Federal Reserve banks would be nationalized, but not the individual member banks. The power to create money was removed from those banks by abolishing the fractional reserve system, the mechanism through which banking system creates money. So the plan called for 100 what's called 100% reserves on checking accounts. What does that mean? It means that if you had money in a checking account, the bank had to keep the money in the bank, warehousing of the money. That's all it meant. And they could charge fees for their services. The second part of the plan, it separated the loan-making function, which can belong in private banks, and I think should belong in private banks. It separated that from the money creation function, which can only belong in government. Lending was still to be a private banking function, but they could only lend deposited long-term savings money, not their created credits. In this way, they'd restrict what was known as an unstable practice called borrowing short and lending long. In other words, making long-term loans with short-term deposits. Some variations of the Chicago Plan propose that this be done through mutual fund-like mechanisms or through entirely new types of chartered banks. The third part of the proposal, the third main aspect, the proposal recognized the distinction between money and credit, which had been confused through fractional reserves and what was called the real bills doctrine. This confusion was seen as one of the causes of depression because when businesses reduced their borrowings on commercial bills, these were called real bills, as they reduced their borrowings in a downturn, the money supply was automatically liquidated. So they understood that this was an unstable practice, basing the money supply on real bills, and that it just aggravated a downturn. Henry Simons, one of the most brilliant economists to have ever lived, made this observation, which is still true today. And this is really at the heart of most of our problems in monetary matters. He said, the mistake lies in fearing money and trusting debt. The mistake lies in fearing money, oh, that's inflationary, and trusting debt. Money itself, and he continues this quoting him, money itself is highly amenable to democratic legislative control because no community wants the value of their currency going up or down very much. But it's not very manageable alongside a mass of private debt and private near monies or alongside a mountain of public debt. Some variations of the Chicago Plan had the U.S. government lending the banks all or part of newly printed cash needed to get them to 100% reserves. This was a very crucial part of the plan back then for the simple reason that depositors were going to the banks just taking out all their money, deflating the system. Every time they took out an amount, then with the fractional reserves, more had to be called in loans, and so on. The government would print the money, loan it to the banks at interest, bring them up to 100% reserves. This elegantly turned all the money that the banks had created over the years from private bank credit into real U.S. government money. It turned the bank into, de facto, turned the bank into a post facto intermediary between the government and the people in issuing the money, and they earned some spread on that in exchange for their loaning work. Now, the best economic minds in the country supported this plan. Paul Douglas wrote, "This proposal will of course be opposed by the bankers, from whom it takes the lucrative privilege of creating purchasing power. It would, however, ensure the safety of deposits, give large revenues to the government, provide complete social control over monetary matters, and prevent abnormal fluctuations in the capital market. At the same time, it would permit the allocation of productive resources to remain primarily in private hands." All in all, it seems the most promising program for the reform of our monetary credit system. Frank Graham wrote that it was self-evident that the right of issuing money belongs in government, that the bank's seniorage profits were a kind of tax on the entire community, And he wrote, quote, "This privilege that the banks enjoy is in no way essential to the lending process." Mariner Eccles, who became chairman of the Fed under Roosevelt, testified that the best course would be for the government to nationalize the Federal Reserve banks. Congressman Jerry Voorhees made the case for 100% reserves, putting money into circulation by paying pensions, paying disabled persons. As late as 1945, Voorhees introduced legislation for a U.S. monetary authority as our sole creator of money. And that phrase, a U.S. monetary authority, I want you to remember that because it's going to come up time and time again, and we are proposing that too. James Angel, who disagreed with the plan, still said it would go far toward making economic activity reasonably stable. Maurice Allais, the great French economist, backed the plan, published a book on it in 1948. Irving Fisher of Yale wrote on it extensively and popularly well in the 1940s. The young Milton Friedman was the best-known advocate of the Chicago Plan in the post-war period. And here's what he said, quote, "Henry Simons held a view which I share, that the creation of fiat currency should be a government monopoly," unquote. Friedman testified on this before Congress as late as 1975, and in 1985 he wrote, quote, "I've not given up advocacy of 100% reserves." Friedman thought that the transition to 100% reserves wouldn't be difficult. He said 25% this year, 50% next year, and so on. Well, you had all of these great minds for it. You had a situation where the bankers had brought the country to its knees in only 20 years. So why didn't it pass? What happened? Turning the plan into law proved very elusive. When Chicago University's Chancellor Maynard Hutchins, and Maynard Hutchins was a great Chancellor of the University and adopted programs there, which I think more than anything else helped people in their thinking processes. We were taught to try to think independently there. And discussion groups generally were encouraged, as well as the other big thing about the university was that they encouraged going to the source of things rather than reading other people's comments. If we were going to read about Aristotle, we'd read Aristotle. We wouldn't read somebody else on Aristotle. And that was new at that time, believe it or not. Now, all right. Hutchins sends a copy of the bill, a copy of the Chicago Plan to Senator Bronson Cutting, December of '33. Cutting asks him to draft a bill. 4 months later, he telegrams Hutchins, "Where's my bill?" And so they sent Simons to present the essentials of the plan to Senator Cutting in Washington, who introduced it in the Senate June 6, 1934, as S3. I have all the bill numbers here. We'll have copies of this for anyone who wants it. Wright Patman introduced it in the House. The bill required 100% reserves on checking accounts, which it separated from savings accounts, which had to keep 5% reserves. It set up a federal monetary authority to control the supply of currency, buying and the buying and selling of government securities. Very important, because that is such a control point also. Now, the American Monetary Act that you have in front of you there, a single reform of 3 parts to bring our money system under proper public control, agrees in its all of its main features with the Chicago Plan. This is not something that has come out of thin air today. We have a long tradition involved in this. First, I'm going to use the word nationalize here. I've been told not to do this. Don't use the word nationalize. Use the word incorporate. Use the word bring into. All right. First, it incorporates the Federal Reserve banks into the U.S. Treasury, where money will be created by the government as money, not as private interest-bearing debt. It'll be spent into circulation to promote the general welfare. It's in our Constitution, promote the general welfare. It'll be monitored to be neither inflationary or deflationary in itself. Second, it removes the bank's privilege to create purchasing media. Well, first I should say, what's the purpose of the first point? If monetary control and the ability to create money is a part of sovereignty, it belongs in our government. Now, why wasn't it there to start with? In the Lost Science of Money book, we discussed the Constitutional Convention and how by misdefining the nature of money, they misdefined it as gold and silver, thanks in part to a book that was put out for the Constitution by John Witherspoon, the only religious signer of the Declaration of Independence. They went with Adam Smith's primitive notion. Kai told us how Smith hadn't done his homework. Well, he hadn't. They went with his primitive notion that only gold or silver are money. And in fact, we know, going back thousands of years just to Aristotle, we know that money is an abstract power. Aristotle told us money exists not by nature, but by law. Well, that means money, in those terms, it's not a commodity out of a mine, it's not something out of a farm. If it exists by law, law is arbitrary in a way, law is abstract. So money, the monetary power, is abstract. By misdefining it as gold and silver, this allowed the idea to be there at the Constitution that the merchants could control this. Because if money were just a commodity that's convenient for making trades, the way the Austrian school continues to misrepresent it, then you could see it as something in the realm of merchants. But if you understood the nature of money as an abstract social power embodied in law, then when you're writing a constitution, you'd better deal with this topic completely. How it's going to be provided, how it's going to be kept relatively stable. The founders, and by the way, the founders, these are not the guys who wrote the Declaration of Independence. You realize that. Jefferson was not there. Tom Paine was not there. Franklin was too old to give his own talk. It's a different crowd. And the Constitution was called on the instigation of the commercial interests to strengthen the national government. In theory, that's what they said. Well, monetary power has always been one of the key features of sovereignty. And it was already in the Articles of Confederation. Article 9 gave the Confederation the power to, what at that time it was in the words, to issue bills of credit was the terminology that they had, was already there. So they're in Washington or where it was written to strengthen the national government, and they fought to keep this out. They fought to keep that provision out, which showed what was really going on. Some of the people wanted to take this power themselves through a private bank, as had already been done in England in 1694. We had no banks in America during the Revolution, except the Bank of North America, which was formed on the initiative of Thomas Paine and actually helped the Revolution. Had we had banks here, it would have been very hard to have that revolution. It would have been harder. We would have done it anyway, I'm sure. Okay, so the monetary power belongs in government. We nationalized the Federal Reserve banks, period. Second, remove from the banks the privilege to create, and I'm going to use the term purchasing media here, rather than money, okay? We remove from the banks the privilege to create purchasing media through the fractional reserve system. I told you how the fractional reserves are ended by, well, I'll get to that now. Why? Why do we have to do that? Now, people have told us, people in this room have told us, oh, you don't have to go that far. You really don't have to go that far. You can let the banks continue to create money. We've seen from the session on Canada, which I found fascinating and was not fully aware of the extent to which the Canadian National Bank has these powers and is not using them. And the reason it's not using them is that the banks also have those powers. If the banks did not have that power to create money, you can bet that it would be being done by the National, is it the National Bank of Canada? What's Bank of Canada? Okay, I'll get the term accurate. So it is essential part of this plan that the banks no longer have the power to create money. And I see some of you want to talk about that. We'll have a question period if you like, and we'll go into that some more tomorrow. But I think in principle, I would ask anyone tomorrow who wants to leave that power in the hands of banks to give me even one justification in principle, morally, why they should have that special privilege. Getting back to Henry George for a moment. Yeah, we'll do that in a question period. Thank you. Getting back to Henry George, this concept that you don't give privileges is so important. Privileges, that's basically an aristocracy. We don't have that here. We don't need it. We're getting it. We are beginning to have it. We have to stop it. Okay. Now, in the American Monetary Act, the government converts all of the money that the banks have already created into U.S. government money by loaning them the money to bring the reserves up to 100%. Now, there may be modifications necessary in that. One of the reasons that it was being done in the Depression was that people were going and taking all their money out of the banks. And so they had to have the printed cash in order to stay open. We may have flexibility in that now, but I do like the idea of not allowing the banks to hang on to all this money that they've created in the past. It's not really a favor to the banks to loan them this money. It's just the opposite. Okay, then from that point on, the banks act as intermediaries, accepting deposits, which will grow. Real deposits will grow because the government is spending lots of new money into circulation for infrastructure and other things. There's going to be money out there to be deposited into banks. So don't think in terms that they're not going to have money available. They will. Today they wouldn't if we applied that rule because there's nobody putting the money into circulation. All right. The banks would act as intermediaries, accepting deposits, loaning them out to borrowers. That which is what people think the banks do now, actually. And they haven't really dissuaded us from that belief, have they? We're not really against bankers, all right? I want to make that clear. I'd rather put it in these terms. We're for, how many of you have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life? Jimmy Stewart? Okay. We're for, what was the guy's name? George Bailey. We're for that type of banker. And we're not for Henry Potter. So that's the distinction for us. Now, the third part. If you do the first part alone, it won't work. Nothing will happen. The Brits did it in 1946. They nationalized the Bank of England on the recommendation or the urging of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which brings up another point. It's extremely important, and we will rely somehow at some time in bringing religious organizations into this fight because they are supposed to be involved on moral questions of this type. And if we can't get them in, it's hard to be involved in a moral crusade. I shouldn't go diverge that much. Okay, now I have to find my spot again. I'll get it. Okay, yeah. Right. Okay. Just the first step wouldn't be enough. England nationalized the Bank of England. Right afterwards, about half the money was created by the English government, half by the banks. At this point, we've been told by Alistair, in his wonderful presentation, that today it's only 3% of the money is created by the government and 47% by the banks. In Canada, we've got the example that they've got the legislation, they have the authority in the Bank of Canada, and yet they can't do it. So in both cases, it's a demonstration that you cannot allow the banks to continue creating money. it will not work. So reform number one, first part of it, nationalizing the Fed, is crucial. Second part, you stop the banks from creating money. If you did just those two things, you would create a disaster because we need new money coming into circulation. So part three is a critical part. And part three, to simplify it, it's really a form of Ken Bonsack's sovereignty proposal. Part three of this reform puts money in, except it doesn't loan it in necessarily, or it can, but it puts money into circulation for infrastructure, beginning with infrastructure. Now, the engineers tell us $1.6 trillion is we're lagging, we're behind $1.6 trillion in infrastructure. There's $1.6 trillion that can go into infrastructure, into jobs around this country. We have people unemployed. In our upstate New York area, it's not 6% unemployment. It's not 10%. I have no idea what it is. It's over 10. It's unemployment, underemployment. It's people suffering. They're there without money. The conditions are horrible. All this while the New York Stock Exchange, 120 miles down river, went through its greatest boom and bust for themselves. So good paying jobs would be created around the country. And the effect of that would not just be on employment. Right now, government at every level is being defunded, consciously defunded, which I regard as a criminal act. On the local level, on the state level, on the federal level, they're trying to wreck our government. Well, in time of war, that's treason. I'm sorry to use these terms, nationalization, treason. But if we can't speak, I don't know how we're going to get reform through. We have to be able at least to speak first and speak our minds. And if this is a result of just some anger, I'll get it out of my system and we'll be okay. No. Governments would be refunded at all levels through taxation of these earnings that come in. The infrastructure would exist there out throughout the country. This can be done using Ken's formula, which he didn't get to in his talk. He used in his sovereignty proposal heavy reliance on per capita amounts so that it goes around the country and it goes around fairly. He had so much per capita for a school district, so much per capita for a county, a state, a city. So the third part creates the money, makes sure that the money's there. With those three things together, this will work. This will really work. And we'll be able to have the kind of systems that you saw in earlier today with private rapid transit. We'll be able to have health care for all of our citizens. We'll be able to have all of the wonderful things that we want and that are within our reach. Am I speaking too long? 10 minutes, okay. Oh yeah, I will. Okay. Now, we go a bit beyond the Chicago Plan in three important improvements derived from the lessons of history and the experience with the Bank of England and our own American experience. First, the infrastructure expenditures were not in the Chicago Plan. We make them. We've observed that privately controlled money systems can't or won't do it. Second, the American Monetary Act introduces considerations of fairness, sustainability, and sound environmental practice, and social cohesion as values in monetary decision-making. In other words, moral considerations are a part of this money system. I'd like to be able to say that we're the first to do that, but we're not. The Europeans have already done this in the European Central Bank, which may be one of the good things that Dr. Martin was referring to. And as I quote from them in chapter 23 of my book, this is in their banking treaty, to promote throughout the community a harmonious and balanced development of economic activities, sustainable and non-inflationary growth, respecting the environment, a high level of employment and social protection, the raising of the standard of living and quality of life, and economic and social cohesion and solidarity among member states. It's already there. Now, the third thing that we've done in the American Monetary Act, we place a more reasonable nationwide legal limit on the charging of interest with an 8% cap, about what it was in most states of the United States in 1980-81. There were usury limits in most state laws at that time, and for the kind of interest rates that were being charged now, you had to go to what was called a loan shark. It's obscene that people are paying 29% a year. It's utterly you cannot have that and expect your society to continue for long. Okay. Friends have told us economists and bankers are strongly going to object to that provision on interest and other parts. Well, you know, we didn't expect them all as allies in this fight. We didn't start this fight. We're involuntarily participating in it. But remember billionaire speculator Warren Buffett's warning remark. He said, if there is a class war in the United States, my class is winning, or won, depending on who you ask. Well, he is being facetious, because Buffett would never describe the purposeful destruction of our most vulnerable fellow citizens and their children as winning. I think he would agree with me that it's a form of cannibalism and that indigestion and worse is coming. Well, why didn't the Chicago Plan pass? They did not have people out there who understood it. They didn't make an effort to educate the public. Simons got cold feet and wanted to keep the discussion on a professorial level of perfection. He demanded perfection from himself, which was not the criteria to use. All they needed to do was make sure that this plan was going to be better than what existed. All right, what about the Austrian economists? What were they up to? And this is also instructive. The Austrian economists, here, what's his name? Oh. Friedrich Hayek, one of my favorite Austrian economists, was arguing against any national currency for, in effect, an international control over all economies through the gold system. Incredibly, he wrote, there is no rational basis for the separate regulation of the quantity of money in a national area that remains part of a wider economic system. And he argued that the independent national currencies don't do any good, get rid of them. He tried to twist the 100% reserves into covering bank deposits 100% with gold, an impossibility, as Bill Hickson's talk told us. There's never enough gold, never has been. Even during the areas when you had the plunder of the Americans and the killing of 15 million Indians to steal their gold, there was still not enough gold. Even during that period, they magnified the gold in Europe by 500%, and prices all went up 500%. All right. Well, Roosevelt's bank legislation went through. The Austrians talk a freedom game, but it's not freedom. It's really a road to serfdom. I promise. They talk a great freedom game. They're promoting serfdom. I personally think that the title of Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, was an inside joke. It's another matter. All right. Roosevelt's 1935 bank legislation was an improvement, big improvement over what had existed, but it wasn't considered the final word on banking reform. Other laws were expected. Over and over, we see economists calling at that time for an end to fractional reserves. Most of the efforts to enact the Chicago Plan ended with World War II as the country went on to a war footing. Okay, any questions?
Steve, first of all, thank you for the talks we've had about this. I think what Steve has there in your folders is really very, very important that everybody here read. I think it's, can I make a comment rather than ask a question? Am I allowed to do that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is Mr. Rick Cook. Go ahead.
It's more, what you have before you is a toolkit. You know, it's not a magic wand. It's a toolkit that, if it's used by responsible, knowledgeable people, can make revolutionary changes. And I think clearly that's what is needed. The question I have, I guess, let me just try to formulate an idea and then see what you think of it, Steve, because the alternative, I think, to monetary reform that you see right now is to kind of use taxation as the method to introduce or reintroduce some kind of equity of incomes, and to come up with the money that you need for investment in infrastructure or for whatever purposes that you're looking for. And I would suggest that if you want to pursue this line of thinking, take a look at Bill Clinton's, the second volume of My Life, because Clinton there makes the case for doing that. He restored some of the income taxes that came out of the Reagan tax cuts. He balanced the federal budget primarily by reducing federal employment by 350,000, and you multiply that out and you get a very huge cut in government expenditures. And at the same time, I know everybody wouldn't agree with this, but there was a bubble created in the stock market through the dot-com bubble that floated the economy and kept employment going until Clinton got ready to leave. Now, what that did not do was prevent the bursting of that bubble, the loss of, $2 trillion in value in pensions and other paper wealth that people thought was real wealth. It wasn't real wealth, it was paper wealth. It did not prevent the Walmartization of the economy, so to speak, that was occurring all through the 90s and which has accelerated with NAFTA and CAFTA and whatever else you want to throw in there. So even though he was able to produce a surplus in the budget for 4 years, the structural problems remained, and in fact were there ready and waiting for what happened to Bush when 9/11 came along and the whole thing just blew up, and leaving us where we are today. So what I would submit is the reason that you can't build these reforms through taxation is you're taxing unreal values. The wealth that the super wealthy have is not real wealth. That is not wealth. That's paper wealth. And our legal system equates that to wealth because it's term property, because it's a debt instrument, and a debt is a contract, and you can buy and sell that contract at full value or at a discount, and somebody's going to be forced to pay that, or you're going to take their stuff away from them. But it's illusory. It's not wealth. It's paper wealth, and that's what all of the bubbles have been built on throughout this, the whole period since the Federal Reserve was established. You've got bubbles being created. You tax the heck out of those bubbles, and the government thinks it's rich for a while. And then the bubble bursts, and you've got a recession, depression, and then you're looking around for a new bubble. And the latest bubble is the housing bubble.
Yeah.
So my question, Steve, is stack up what we're proposing, what you have here, against a system where we're taxing bubbles to try to get out of it, and just comment on where we end up with that.
Okay. I don't think the other systems can work. Quite simply, they're frauds. What we're trying to do with this is get to the basics, get down to the ground, the bedrock, and these are really minimum things that we're talking about here. These are the minimum things. They won't do it long term without also an increase in education, an increase in people understanding economics, and some of the concepts that have been presented here need to be better understood. Economists have to be held to much higher standards of definition, because right now, those types of plans or those types of ideas are part of what I would call a clandestine religion known as economics. It's no longer a science. They've deified the market. They think that the market knows everything, that it's, so don't try, because it's got input from so many sources, don't try to outsmart the market. The market's got all this information from all around the world, and it's got the data. It's omniscient. They think that don't try to, they tell you, don't try to pass laws that restrict the market to do this. It'll just run over your little laws. It's omnipotent. And the third thing, if you do the right thing, the market will reward you. And if you misbehave, the market will punish you. So it's beneficent. What are they defining? They're defining a God. They've snuck that one in. So, does that answer your question, or do you want to make another?
I have a question regarding the function of the private banking sector. You mentioned that you like to keep loans and creation of money separated, and loans for the private banking sector. And I have a question with respect to transformation of maturities. I'm not sure whether this is the correct English term. You said you're opposed to borrowing short and lending long, but I consider this function of the private banking sector as quite important. If you take away this function, I am afraid that we're losing a lot of efficiency within the monetary system.
Yeah, that would be true with the present system. But if you're changing the system and the basics of it and the structures of it, then it's generally regarded as a good idea to combine the periods of the maturities of your deposits with the loans, because you don't have a situation arise where both the depositor and the borrower want the money at the same time. So you reduce risk, yeah. That's one less risk. But to understand how it would really function, the other changes that are occurring would remove any, I would think, remove any objections to restricting borrowing or reducing borrowing short and lending long.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The act that's being proposed, you suggested that it caps interest at 8%.
Yeah.
And my question is just why is the act advocating interest at all?
Good question. One version had that differently. We said no interest. I don't want to create a huge argument over that. I'm just going to explain why we did it that way. We did it that way because that's where the rates were in 1980. That's where the limits were in 1980, and the society was functioning, and things, we existed quite well, and so we put it at that level. If to remove it would be a different law. That's a different movement, which I think maybe you could make a good case for, but let's do this in steps.
Just a follow-up to that question, actually. Can you hear me? Just a follow-up to that question. Yeah, right. Just a follow-up to that question. I'm a little worried about the fact that there is an arbitrary limit of 8% or any percent at all, actually, because, for example, if interest rates were running at 8%, but the money supply was only increasing by 6%, then the economy is headed for trouble, I would suggest.
Well, that's a very good point, and we'll go into more detail on what this act does. But one of the things it does is sets up a federal monetary authority, national monetary authority, which would be looking at that type of question in detail, so that in theory should not happen. That if that situation were arising, this authority has the power to adjust the money supply. Now, the Chicago plan preferred less flexibility. They wanted to have it really just go pretty much automatically by regulation, and there are advantages to that in the sense that everybody knows exactly what to expect. But there are disadvantages to that, and my own experience in markets leads me to think that it's not a good idea to present a stationary target to the various financial operators. You need to have flexibility in dealing with them so that they are unsure of what's going to happen. Otherwise, you get the type of situation as you had in England where, what's his name? Speculator George Soros, all right, is reputed to have brought down the English pound a few years back. Now, that, by the way, the euro has solved that kind of problem. That can't happen anymore. There are actual provisions in the euro legislation which give each member state independent ability to go after speculators like that, and that's a good thing. I know what goes on in commodity markets. I was in them for years, and when I hear the theoretical descriptions of them from economists of the Austrian type usually, and I put that together with my own experience watching what happens, they don't understand what's really happening in markets. They have to go in there and participate before they will. And they're going all by ideology, basically, and it's just not real. It's not real. The first thing you learn about speculation is that, and the markets, is that nothing really happens until gambling starts. And we observe that I won't go into all those details.
I would like to ask Mr. Zarlenga whether he's not troubled
Can't hear you.
by the fact that his description of banks, of reducing banks to sheer intermediaries, happens to be what they claim to be all the time.
I know.
Just borrowing money and lending it. On the other hand, correct me if I am wrong, I miss in your proposed legislation the fact that that the pillars, the four financial pillars that Roosevelt separated very, very clearly in his Bank Act of 1935, you seem to pass by. Most of the bubbles that we are experiencing, and they'll grow bigger and burst bigger, happen to be where the banks have taken over the liquidity pools of the stock market,
I know.
of the mortgage companies, and of the insurance companies, and played their strange games with them. Surely you should begin there before putting the banks wholly out of business by doing away with fractional reserves.
Well,
how do we know whether fractional reserves work or don't work if the
Here's how.
statutory reserves have been abolished?
Here-
I have
Here's how. It's really a question of power, Bill, the way I look at it. They have so much power in this system where they can, in effect, create purchasing media, call it money, that they can overturn these restrictions. And as you call the four pillars, well, some of the points that came out of the Depression, the three main points that I focus on usually. First, control over margin. During the stock market boom, there was very little margin required, and the one restriction was that the Federal Reserve in 1935 could control margin and raise the margin level to dampen speculation. Another very big thing that people don't realize is that there was a rule against short selling. That short selling was only to occur on an uptick. Now, you probably know what that means. Each tick of a stock can either be up, moving up a little bit, or it's a down tick, it moves down to the next level. During the speculative periods there, what would happen is that there would be more stock sold short than actually existed for a company, and there was no way to stop that. So they did two things. First of all, you had to have an uptick before you could have a short sale. Now, what that meant was that people actually holding the stock were first in line if they wanted to sell it. And people trying to go short the stock had to wait until there was an uptick, and there would never be an uptick as people were selling. So you would essentially eliminate short selling. And the other part that eliminated that was forcing the short sellers to actually have borrowed the stock before they go short. And that borrowing process, which occurs through brokers, meant that you could not sell more stock than existed because you couldn't borrow it from someone who already had it. And these ideas worked quite well until the advent of the futures market, the index futures, because the index futures allow any amount of short selling without any uptick. There's no borrowing of securities, and we saw what happened in '87 when that meltdown occurred. So, to answer your question, that much power in the hands of the financial community is going to be abused. It'll just take 20, 30 years, wherever, and you'll be back at the same spot. But another answer to your question is, what is the justification for such privilege to be in private hands?
But let's be less passionate and see whether we want government to distribute, to assess risk in the market and apportion loans. I wouldn't want that.
Well, Bill, I'm sure you also don't want what we've seen happening. So, anyway, I know that we have problems with government. I know that there has been an attitude toward government that most of us have. I think I know where it started. It started with Adam Smith. It started with Adam Smith in his attack on the English government. And this is detailed in my book. We give the actual quote of it. I don't have the page, it's in chapter 12. And essentially, Adam Smith went on a rampage against the English government. If you want emotionalism, go read that. I don't think I'm that emotional. Although if I am, I'll adjust. I'm not a bitter person. Okay, but Adam Smith's attack on England, we find the source of it, we find the actual words, and we see the reason. The reason was to keep the private Bank of England in control of England's money. It's explicit. It's explicit in the attack. You read that in chapter 12. So he did us the great favor of showing us not only the origin of the attack on government, which today has been magnified. You turn on a radio and all you hear is Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and this Savage guy, all these caricatures against government. Well, the fact is that the government is the only thing, the only organizational entity that can stand between us and Enron. And so we need, I saw how this started in my own life, Bill, when I graduated from the University of Chicago in the final year there. We were all asked to write an essay on the theme, yes, we should try to influence politics, or no, we should leave all that dirty business to other people and concentrate on higher things, okay? Now, the very asking of that question should never have occurred like that. We need to rebuild a public spirit. We need young people coming up not to be afraid of their government or of the work that's involved in making it better, and we have to set an example to them. I think the government, under proper conditions, can do excellent jobs in many ways, and that's the kind of input. I'm not asking for another question because we're going to end this now. That's the kind of input we'd like tomorrow at the session. Oh, someone else has a microphone out there. There we go. All right, Byron.
I want to actually, my questions, I have two. I'll combine them into one and they play off Bill's, I think. Because what is the plan here to get rid of the public and private debt? You talked about the government debt, but both the private debt, household sector debt, and the incorporated business debt, the business debt is both higher than the federal government debt. And wouldn't you have to impose some sort of moratorium on foreclosures to stop the bankers from moving in immediately and foreclosing on so many people? You'd cause such an uproar that you'd never have a chance to address anything you're trying to accomplish.
I think the answer is yes. And so what we have here is really the core of what has to be done. Money is created also in stock markets. You wouldn't allow that to continue. Money creation has to be simply in our government. And in the period of getting from where we are now to where we want to get, moratoriums of that sort would probably be necessary. We can't put all of that into this, but that kind of thinking, I think, would be required. Okay.